Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Sagalong 2020. Sorry I didn't make a Sagalong video yesterday, but this is an event that myself and a handful of other top-notch booktubers are doing to celebrate for the second year in a row the glories of the Icelandic sagas. We started off the month by doing the same saga. The first 2 weeks of February were the Laxdala saga, where we all talked about the same thing. And then we were set free into the wild, all of us, to do our own sagas. And the saga that I have in mind today to talk about was famous, of course, when it was, a largely oral composition around the 8th or 9th century in the Scandinavian world. And then it was famous again in the 13th century when a lot of these things were codified and written down and started to get copied and spread around. And then this particular saga became famous the third time, more so than the first two put together, in a way that has been forgotten. Unfortunately, that's the way of literature, is that fads come and go. And it's Frithiof saga, which is the story of two households, as so many of these Icelandic sagas are. There was a household of a king who had two sons and a daughter. The daughter was beautiful and virtuous, and across the fjord, across just the next neighbor over, was an old friend of the king. He was not a king himself, but was a landowner, one of these prosperous seigneurial farmers that crop up all over the Icelandic sagas. And he had a son named Frithiof, who, as all the children grew together, of course they knew each other, lived together, they were intimate. And as Frithiof grew, he became glorious, a glorious young man. Not only physically, of course, which meant a lot in that world. It meant a lot if you grew up tall of limb and spare of keel and whatnot, long and flowing hair, but also mentally and morally. He could craft a line of poetry. He was upstanding. He was wise beyond his years. A dreamboat, a total dreamboat. And as you would imagine from such a plotline, he began to tender his affections to the daughter of the king, Ingeborg. And her brothers didn't like that, had always been from the very beginning jealous of Frithiof, probably, although it's only slightly implied in the saga, probably because their own father, the king, favored Frithiof and thought, my sons are okay, sure, metza, but this is a kid, now this is a son. Probably it was something along those lines. You know how sibling things go. Frithiof and these boys were basically siblings, and he was better than they were. Faster, stronger, more handsome, more attractive, more compelling for adults, and also the apple of Ingeborg's eye. And they didn't like that at all, and it simmered in tension between them. And then as another element that happens in the Icelandic sagas often is that we get the passage of time. These aren't stories held in bottles. They aren't frozen in amber. People grow old and die, and things change that in a way that only time can change them. And in the course of this story, both the king and his old friend across the fjord die. And Frithiof takes over his father's estate, of course, and the two sons take over their father's kingdom, their father's little pocket kingdom. Probably, if we were to dig into the whatever factual basis there is behind this saga, in the 7th or 6th century, probably we would find that the two men that the kingdom is just a piece of nomenclature. Probably we would find that the holdings and their worth was about the same, but it doesn't matter. The two sons took over their father's kingdom and forbade their daughter to see Frithiof. They forbade him to see her. In fact, at one point, they move her to the shrine of Baldur, a Norse god of light and purity. And this particular shrine was a place of holy sanctity, where no hint of love or romance or even physical contact could take place. So picture it like the personal quarters at the Trump White House. And it didn't work. It didn't keep Frithiof away from Ingeborg. And so eventually they decided to send him out, to send him on a mission to the Orkney Islands. That because he himself was honest, he suspected no trap, or maybe had no alternative, and left. He went as their emissary, and while he was out of the country, the brothers married Ingeborg to a neighboring king who was very old. So obviously a sentence of servitude, obviously not a love match, obviously treating her as gold plate something like that. An obvious attempt to get her out of the reach of Frithiof. And as a side note, as a particularly Scandinavian side note, they burned his house and all of his holdings. It's just on their way out, they just sort of totally dispossess him and rack and ruin all the cattle and everything. And when he gets back, he goes insane with rage at the broken heart and also at the wrong of it all, and commits the dramatic high point of this saga, which is to burn the Shrine of Balder. Which is not, I have never read, I've only read two, I will get to the second one. I've only read 2 translations of Frithiof Saga. I've never read anything in English that conveys the enormity of that act. Of course, Frithiof can't stay in the country once he's done that. It's not like he and those 2 brothers are the only people who use the shrine. So he goes raiding. He becomes a raider. He becomes a Viking, and travels the sea and has all sorts of adventures and battles and whatnot. And we have a very good 9th century etching of what Frithiof looked like when he was a Viking. It's actually very detailed. You wouldn't expect it. Look at that. Oh, that is Frithiof. Hubba hubba. And after a few years, he comes back. After a while, the sort of unspoken idea is that you can expurgate your sins against the community by being gone for a while, and then you come back. He comes back, and he lives with the old king that Ingeborg is married to. And like everyone else except those 2 brothers, the old king comes to love him, admire and love him, kind of sort of wish that he were a son. And the saga is very delicate on the obvious question of whether or not Frithiof was cuckolding the king with Ingeborg in the king's own house while he was gaining this admiration. The saga, at least that I know, is very quiet on that subject. But when the old king dies, he leaves his kingdom to Frithiof. And finally, the 2 are free to marry and have children. And that's what they do. And you would think that's a nice, warm, happy ending, but of course this is an Icelandic saga. So yes, we have that nice, warm, happy ending, and then Frithiof burns and dispossesses the kingdom of the 2 brothers. He goes on a raid and burns down all of their houses and all their property, kills all their cattle. There's something refreshingly South Boston about these Icelandic sagas. And it's a heck of a story. It's very, very entertaining. It's the normal routine, the normal pattern of love frustrated and then kind of, sort of achieved. And it was translated into Swedish in the 1700s. And about 100 years later, a Swedish literary figure, strange, odd Swedish literary figure, Esaias Tegnér, decided to take Frithiof Saga and translate it, but also adapt it and expand it and give it a poetic rhythm and a modern sensibility that it is not present in the original saga. He changes around a little, and Tegnér himself, he wrote. It was sort of a literary experiment. I don't think he was expecting that it would take off the way it did. In fact, I know he wasn't, because he said it. He wrote it in letters to friends that I didn't expect ever to be a famous writer. But he wrote a brief adaptation of a part of Frithiof Saga and published it in a magazine, and it did take off. It did take off. It struck the literary sensibilities of the day, and he quickly added to it. He quickly made it into a book called Frithiof Saga. And in his introduction and in his talk about the saga, he always mentioned, I am freely adapting. This is not a translation. This is a free adaptation of this old saga. I am changing things. I am neatening things. I am fixing what I consider to be dramatic flaws in the original story. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter. The book shot across Europe. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone was reading it. Even, I think, Goethe, at age like 250, was saying, this is awesome. and everyone wanted it translated into their own language. Everyone wanted to read this latest phenomenon by a still comparatively young poet who, because of his sudden literary fame, was in correspondence with all the great literary figures of his day. And one of those figures was, because Tegnér learned English gradually, slowly, but ultimately perfectly. He had an absolutely megawatt brain. And one of those figures was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, my very own Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And Longfellow and a few collaborators of his made a version of Frithiof Saga that didn't read. If Tegner was an adaptation of the original saga, the Longfellow et al. Translation was an adaptation of Tegner, and it had a vogue. I'm talking about lost, about vanished fame here in many cases. No one remembers Esaias Tegner outside of Sweden anymore. And no one remembers Longfellow anymore. No one remembers in America, has any remembrance, that once upon a time everything Longfellow did was a bestseller in bookstores. Everything he touched, readers wanted. And he did a version of Frithiof Saga, which is the thing. The Frithiof Saga is not in the big Saga of the Icelanders volume from Penguin that a lot of us here at Sagalong are reading and loving having. So I had to go elsewhere. I had to go to the Stockholm Royal Printing House in 1953. I had to go to the Collector's Library. This is a limited editions club, the Royal Printing House. And this is Frithiof Saga, translated by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow et al. And it came in this lovely faux wood box. See, there we go. There is Frithiof Saga, and this has illustrations all throughout, black and white illustrations all throughout, on all almost every page. There's poor Ingeborg. Look at her. There goes her boy, off to sea. See, there he goes. He's gone off to raid shores and also hit the Soliflex. And this also has Longfellow's poetry all throughout. I wanted to read you a bit of that. I couldn't let you get through with this without reading it. I'll just go to the very beginning. This is when Frithiof and Ingeborg were children. See, there they are in their innocence. When their brothers are also children, her brothers are also children. No tragedy has yet dawned. And that the opening, I'm only going to read you a bit of this, I promise. I promise I could read Longfellow out loud all day long. But I will read you just a bit so you can get a feel for what your great-grandfathers flocked to bookstores to read if they were in America. There grew in Hilding's manor fair 2 plants beneath his fostering care. The North before saw never blended such beauty sweet and promise splendid. The one shot oak-like from the green, and like a lance its stalk was seen. Its crown, which the breezes trembled, in arch a warrior's helm resembled. The other flourished like a rose, when winter flees with all his snows. But spring, within the tree, the rose tree hiding, dreams yet in bud, her glory biding. But round the earth the storm shall wend, then shall the oak therewith contend. Spring's sun shall mount the heavens glowing, then opes the rose, her red lips showing. Thus grew they up, sport and glee, and Frithiof was the sturdy tree. The rose with dew and glory laden was Ingeborg, the lovely maiden. Saw'st thou the twain in noonday's light? Would seem that Freya's mansion bright, which many a bride pair gay discloses, with flaxen hair and wings of roses. But shouldst thou see in evening sheen their dances under awnings green, thou wouldst thou think in linden bowers elf king and queen dance out the hours. Oh, how his heart within him burned, when of the runes his first was learned. There was no kingly honor better, he might to Ingeborg teach the letter. With her how blithely he would sleep upon his sloop, the dark blue deep. How gaily at each frequent turning she claps her hands, all terror spurning. Birds' nests so high there was not found, that he for her brought not to ground. The eagles fierce on storm clouds rocking, he spoiled of young, their fury mocking. Nor was there brook, though loud its roar, but o'er it Ingeborg he bore. How sweet to feel when torrents murmur, the clasp of small white arms grow firmer. And so on, and so on, and so on, in this lovely edition which goes all the way to 250 glorious Longfellowian pages. So that is my saga for today. It's Frithiof Saga and the story behind it. Because Longfellow translated this thing with his collaborators, and it did well. It caught on. It echoed the last embers of that fad, that dying fame that Tegner had given it. Tegner himself went on to lead a very weird, very weird and spotty life. Gradually lost his mind, but the illness that seemed to unseat his reason for the first time is a little bit of a mystery. He recovered, or seemed to, but the rumor had it that he originally suffered this illness because because he used a tainted douche. Which is an awful way to contract something, I think you would have to agree. But he went away to a sanatorium and apparently recovered, but not completely. He gradually lost his mind. The letters that he would send to Longfellow got stranger and stranger as time went on. And died, the legend has it, and because he was such a sweet and talented figure, I think we can allow him the legend. The legend has it that he died completely peacefully under the Aurora Borealis one night. So there you go. That is my Sagalong for this week. Frithiof Saga. Don't know what I'll be doing for next week, but if I know ahead of time, I will let you know. This was sort of happenstance. So I'm going to wrap this up, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.